So the second intermediate host can change, right? All of them will have operculated eggs. All have operculated eggs, except what? Except your schistosoma. And all have infective form as metacercariae, except again schistosoma. Right? So if you remember these four lines, you'll remember all of the cestodes. Now coming back to the fasciola hepatica. Now fasciola hepatica, hepatica only means liver. So it is called as the common liver fluke or the sheep liver fluke because sheep can also be the definitive host here, right? It might be, but man is definitely the definitive host. Coming to the first intermediate host, the first is always going to be snail. For all of them, the first is always going to be the snail, but the second one changes. So the second one for Fasciola hepatica is plants, and for one more, it's plants, which is your Fasciolopsis. So you can just remember it like this, write it down with me, that both the ones starting with Fasciola or Fascio Lopsis. So fascio and fasciolopsis both have plants as the second intermediate host, right? Fasciola, fasciolopsis. Both the ones that are having fascia will have plants as the second intermediate host. I told you infective is all metacercarian, eggs are all operculated. I'm not going to go into that. I'm just trying to make you remember the intermediate and the name. Clonorchis sinensis. Clonorchis is called as the Chinese liver fluke. It is called as the Chinese liver fluke. And this is also the cause of cholangiocarcinoma. Cholangiocarcinoma is the cancer of the bile duct, right? So this is something that can stay in the bile duct for a very long time and cause cholangiocarcinoma. Here, what can you remember? What is the second intermediate host for Clonorchis? It is going to be the fish. Now for Clonorchis and Opisthorchis, it's the fish. So now how will you remember it? That the ones ending with the kiss, aptkis plus kiss is equal to fish. So Clonorchis and Opisthorchis have fish as the second intermediate host, right? Now what are we left with? We have Opisthorchis. I've already talked about. It is not called anything, but it has fish. Fasciolopsis I talked about. It is a giant intestinal fluke. That is why it is the biggest fluke also, and it is by the plants. Finally, we are left with Paragonimus westermani, which is called as the oriental lung fluke. So it is part of the lung. And we only had left with crab or crayfish. So Paragonimus westermani is the only one that has crab or crayfish as the second intermediate host. So just revising it, definitive host for all cystodes is man. All cystodes have two intermediate hosts except your schistosoma that only has one, which is going to be the first intermediate host, that is going to be the snail. All have operculated eggs except schistosoma that has non-operculated eggs, right? Non-operculated. All have infective form as metacercariae except schistosoma that has cercariae, right? Finally, fasciola and fasciolopsis have second intermediate host as plants. So both the ones that are starting with fascia and the ones ending with kiss are going to have fish as the second intermediate host. And Paragonimus westermani is lonely. He's the only one that is having crab or crayfish as the second intermediate host. So this whole thing completes our trematodes. Now moving on to the nematodes. Nematodes are something that are called as roundworms, right? So they are called as roundworms, right? So they are divided based upon what part they are infecting. If they are infecting the large intestine, small intestine, tissues, and somatic cells, right? We're going to start with the large intestine. So in the large intestine, we have mainly two. That is going to be the Trichuris trichera and that is going to be the Entropius vermicularis. Now, Trichuris trichera is called as a whipworm because the worm's shape looks like a whip. So it is thickened at one point and then it becomes extremely thin, right? So it looks like a whip. Have you seen how you hit with the whip? There's one mota part at one side and then one thin part on the other. So that is called as a whipworm. Definitive host for all of the nematodes is going to be man. So can you see how the definitive host for all the nematodes? So man, definitive host for all of them is going to be man, right? Okay. Coming to the intermediate host, for the intermediate host, you remember that there is no intermediate host for the intestinal ones, right? No intermediate host for the intestinal ones, but there is an intermediate host when we talk about the tissue and the somatic one because they are vector transmitted. They are transmitted by some vector. Infective form is going to be the embryonated egg for Trichuris. And if you've seen the egg of a Trichuris, it is a barrel-shaped one which has two mucus plugs in the end, right? That is the that is the trichura, and that transmission is by the ingestion of the egg. Remember, whenever the egg is going to be the infective form, it is always going to be by the ingestion of the egg. Now, coming to Enterobius vermicularis, Enterobius is called as the pinworm or the thread worm because if you've seen the worm, it looks very thin. It looks almost like a very small thread has been placed like this. So it is a very small worm. Again, I've talked about the definitive host and the intermediate host. The egg is going to be embryonated egg. And whenever we talk about the eggs of Enterobius, we have to talk how they are D-shaped. So they are D-shaped, they are flat from one point and they are curved on the other. And that is why they are called as plano-convex. So they are the plano-convex eggs. Again, if they are talking about eggs, we are talking about ingestion is the way of transmission and even auto-infection. That was about the large intestine. Now coming to the small intestine. In small intestine, we have Ascaris lumbricoids. That is the biggest nematode. It is the biggest nematode, right? It is the biggest one, and that it's also called as a roundworm. It's called as a roundworm. Man is the definitive host. Intermediate host is not going to be there for the intestinal ones, but the infective form is going to be the embryonated egg containing the L2 larva. But because the infective form is the egg, it is going to be by the transmission is by the ingestion. Up until here, everything was egg and ingestion, right? Till these three. Rest all are going to be by your L3 larva, which is the filariform larva. And larvas always end up penetrating the skin. So these are going to be by the penetration of skin, right? Okay, coming to your Ankylosarcoma duodenale. Ankylostoma and Necator americanus are together called as hookworms. So they are called as hookworm. So Ankylostoma duodenale and Necator americanus. So you can remember that America is New World, right? America is New World, so it is called as a New World hookworm, and Ankylostoma is called as the Old Worm hookworm. Rest everything is the same. Man is the definitive host, no intermediate host, L3 larva by the penetration of skin. Same thing. Coming to Strongyloid stercoralis, it is called as a military worm. Why is it called as a military worm? Because Strongyloid stercoralis is one of them which causes massive auto-infection. Right? Strongyloid stercoralis is also one of the worms that is transmitting or that is kind of dividing by parthenogenesis. It is called as parthenogenesis. That means there is no male, only the female fertilizes itself and gives rises to these larvae, right? So it is actually ovoviviparous. So what is ovoviviparous? That means it makes the eggs which contains the larva, and as soon as these eggs are released, they immediately hatch out into larva. So they are ovo because of the eggs and viviparous matlab larva. So as soon as the eggs are laid, it hatches into the larva. It doesn't take time. It doesn't need time to hatch. It immediately hatches into the into the larva, and L3 form is the filariform larva, that is the infective form, which is by penetration of skin. So now you know which worm causes parthenogenesis. It is going to be your Strongyloid stercoralis, and it is also ovoviviparous because the eggs immediately hatch out into larva. That was about the small intestine. Now I'm going to talk about now I'm going to talk about the sorry, that was about the small intestine. Now I'm going to talk about the tissue or the somatic trematodes. Now, first thing is your Wuchereria bancrofti. These are all called as the filarial worms, right? So the ones on the top five, these are called as the filarial worms, right? So these are the filarial worms, and this group is going to be vector transmitted. So some kind of a vector is going to be involved in their transmission. Man is going to be the definitive host, but here the intermediate host is going to be there because whatever the vector is there, that is going to be the intermediate host. So now Wuchereria bancrofti is going to be transmitted by a mosquito, right? And which one? Culex cucaneufatus, which is a by mosquito bite. So Culex is the vector. Here again, all of them will have the L3 larva. So that is being same. L3 filariform is going to be the same for all of them. So you don't need to remember it individually. What you need to remember is the intermediate host. So Wuchereria has the intermediate host as mosquito, which is the Culex. Brugia malai has the intermediate host as mosquito, which is the Mansonia. Loa loa has the intermediate host as a fly, which is called as the chrysops flies or the deer flies or the red flies. Onchocerca volvulus is the one that is also by flies, but the flies here are Similian flies or black flies. Mansonella is also by flies, which is your culicoides, which are called as midgets. And finally, Dracunculus medinensis in it was there previously in India, a very prevalent parasitic infection, not there anymore. It was called as the guinea worm disease. It was the second intermediate host was Cyclops, and it was mainly by the ingestion of water containing the Cyclops, right? So these are all the tissue and somatic ones. What you need to remember is the intermediate host and the name of it, which can be mosquito or flies or cyclops. Now, another question that you get very commonly is about the filarial worms or the microfilaria, and they can be giving you a picture of if it is a sheathed organism or if it is an unsheathed. So, filarial microfilaria, which is the L1 larva, we have six of them, in which three are sheath and then the rest are unsheath. So now how will you remember what is a sheath? Sheath is a protective covering around the worm, right? It is like a protective covering around the worm. And how will you remember it? If you've ever played cricket or if you've ever seen cricket, you will know there is something called as a leg before wicket, right? So you put a leg before the wicket to protect or to sheath your wicket. So if these are your wickets, you are putting a leg before the wicket to sheath the wicket from the ball coming and hitting the wicket. So it's called as leg before wicket. You are sheathing the wicket. So these are the three organisms L, B, and W that are sheath. And which ones are those? They are the Loa Loa. There's Brugia malai, and then there is Wuchereria bancrofti. So if you see the head end, so the first picture is the head end. These are the sheath. So these are all sheathed, right? So these are all sheath. So L, B, and W are sheath. Now coming to the tail end. So this is the tail end. Now the problem with this is that the amount of nuclei that are there in the tails are different. So starting from top, the L, there is going to be maximum amount of nuclei and it is going to go up until the tail tip. So this is the tail tip. All the nuclei are going up until the tail tip, right? When we talk about Brugia malai, in Brugia malai, there are 4 to 5 nuclei in the tail tip, but there are two widely spaced. So there's going to be two widely spaced nuclei. Zooming into the image, can you see how there's these two widely placed nuclei? And you will remember MALAYI. So these are and A are the ones that are the widely placed nuclei, right? Coming to Wuchereria bancrofti, as you go further down, L, B, and W, the nuclei becomes completely absent. There is no nuclei and they have a pointed tail tip. So this was about these three filarial organisms that are sheath and what amount of or how much amount of nuclei is present in their tail tip. Now, what we are left with are these that are your Onchocerca, Manzanella streptocerca, and Manzanella ozarti. What you need to remember is that they are not sheath. They don't have a sheath around. They are not sheath. If you see the picture, there is no sheath, nothing, right? Some of them are going to have a pointed tail tip and some of them are going to have a blunt tail tip. How will you remember it? You will remember that O have no nuclei but have pointed tails. So the ones starting with O, which are your Onchocerca and your Ozardi Manzanella, these are the ones that I have said, oh no, have no nuclei, but because God took away the nuclei, they gave them pointed tips, right? So let's see. So we have Onchocerca and then we have Ozardi, where the tail tip is there, which is pointed, right? So it is pointed tail tip, but no nuclei. So pointed, and the other rest two are blunt. So these two are blunt, which is Manzanella perstans and Manzanella streptocerca. So this completes our parasitology, and now we're going to be starting off with the virology. And the first topic that we are going to be discussing is the general virology, and we will be starting with the morphology. So, whenever we talk about a virus, we talk about what is an entire virus. An entire virus is going to be called a virion, where it is going to contain the nucleic acid, which could either be a DNA or an RNA. Right, and it contains a capsid, which is like a covering or a coating that protects the nucleic acid. So capsid looks something like this, in which there is going to be the DNA or the RNA material. Now, when we talk about the DNA and the RNA viruses, we have to classify them if they are DNA or RNA. And I have a mnemonic for the DNA viruses, which is called as HAPPY. So HAPPY, in which H and P's are all two in number. So first one, it's going to be the herpes or the hepedna. Hepedna includes your hepatitis B virus, right? It includes your hepatitis B virus. Then A is for your adenovirus, P is for your pox and the parvovirus. Then another P is for your polyoma or the papilloma virus, which together is called as the papova virus. And if you remember all the hap till now, then ye, you remember the happy. Ye is not a virus. It is just for you to remember it, to just to complete the mnemonic. So it is happy. Anything else, any other viruses that don't fall into this happy category, they are the RNA viruses. So rest also, you don't have to remember the RNA viruses, just remember the DNA viruses, and anything else except these viruses are going to be the RNA virus. Moving on to the strands. So how many strands does each have? So that they can be either single stranded or they can be double stranded. Like they can have two strands or they can have a single strand. So just remember that all the DNA viruses are double stranded. So DNA are double stranded except one, which is going to be your parvovirus. So parvovirus is a single-stranded DNA virus because it is the smallest DNA. It is the smallest virus also. So because it is small, it is only single-stranded. Rest all the other DNA viruses are double-stranded. Now, coming to the RNA viruses, all RNA viruses are single-stranded. That means they're only going to have one single strand, except your P and R, which is your picorna and your reovirus, right? So these two are the ones, these are the RNA viruses that are not single-stranded, they are double-stranded. Coming to how many segments or what are segmented and which viruses are non-segmented or unsegmented. So all the DNA viruses are going to be unsegmented. So because DNA viruses are double-stranded, it's difficult to make segments from it. But because RNA viruses are single-stranded, it is easy for them to be broken down and form different segments. So all the RNA viruses are also unsegmented except for a mnemonic, which I call it as the Bora Bora Islands. So Bora Bora Islands are a very beautiful islands that are segmented, right? They have water all around and they are small segmented island groups called as the Bora Bora. So what is the or viruses? It's going to be your Bunia, your orthomyxoviruses that contains what? That contains influenza virus, right? Orthomyxoviruses contains the influenza. Then we have the Rio virus, and finally we have the arena. So just remember, Bora Bora Islands are segmented islands, and that is why these four viruses, and they are all RNA viruses, they are the segmented virus. Rest all the other viruses are unsegmented. Coming to enveloped. So when we talk about the enveloped viruses, the envelope is mainly made up of the lipid, right? It is mainly made up of two layers. One is going to be the lipid layer, and then there is another layer. So when we talk about the enveloped viruses, just remember that these all viruses that will be enveloped, be it DNA or RNA, they are going to have one part from the host and one part of their own. So whenever they move out from the host virus, they bud out of the host virus, taking a layer with them. That is what is forming the envelope. So they are going to kind of bud out of the host cell and taking some part of the host cell and then forming an envelope. So most are enveloped. So most are going to be enveloped. They are going to be budding out like most viruses, except in DNA viruses we have the PAP, and in RNA viruses, we have Prachi. So I remember it as that PAPs are the photographers that keep clicking these celebrities and all, right? So PAPs are clicking Prachi because she doesn't have an envelope. They've recognized her. She doesn't have an envelope. So PAPs are going to keep clicking pictures of Prachi because she doesn't have a covering. She doesn't have an envelope. So in P, we have the parvo, then we have the adeno, then we have the papova, which contains your papilloma and polyoma. And in your RNA, we have picorna, Rio, A hepatitis, calcivirus, and hepatitis E, right? Coming to the size now. So, which one is the smallest virus? I already told you that parvovirus is the smallest and it is a single-stranded virus. It is a DNA virus, but it is single-stranded. Who is the largest virus? It is going to be the pox virus. So an interesting thing about the pox virus is that pox viruses can also be sometimes visible on the light microscope because they are so big. So they are so big that they can also become visible in light microscope, right? Who has the largest genome? So when we talk about the genome, it is going to be the retroviruses. And who has the smallest genome? So whatever is the smallest virus, which is the parvo, is definitely going to have the smallest genome. And with that, we have the hepatitis B and D also that have the smallest genome. Moving on to where are the viruses replicating? So all the DNA viruses, right? So DNA viruses, they go and they go inside the nucleus because that is where our DNA is. That is where all the machinery to make the DNA is. So they go inside the host nucleus and they replicate there, right? Because all the machinery to make the DNA is going to be there in the nucleus. So all DNA viruses replicate in the nucleus except the pox virus, because pox virus is so big that it is unable to enter the nucleus. So it ends up in the cytoplasm and it replicates in the cytoplasm. All RNA viruses replicate in the cytoplasm except two. One is going to be your retrovirus because retroviruses are the HIV viruses that go and integrate in our DNA. So that is why they have to go inside the nucleus because they want to get integrated into our DNA, and they can only do it by going inside the nucleus. So one is retrovirus and the second one is your orthomyxovirus, which I just told you is your influenza virus. Right? Now, where are they assembled? Now, multiplication has taken place, but the whole assembly has to take place somewhere, right? So, all the DNA viruses are assembled also in the nucleus, except what? Except pox, because pox didn't enter the nucleus only, and hepedna, which contains your hepatitis B virus, because hepatitis B has a partial DNA structure. It has a partial double-stranded structure, right? It has a partial double-stranded DNA structure. So half strand of it needs to be assembled in the cytoplasm. So that is why pox and hepatna are two viruses that are DNA viruses that are assembled in the cytoplasm. All the RNA viruses are assembled in the cytoplasm. Simple. So most of them were made in the cytoplasm, except few, except your retrovirus and the orthomyxoviruses, but they are assembled in the cytoplasm only. Now, there is something called as the eclipse phase, right? So what is eclipse phase? It is when the virus entry has happened into the host till the presence or till the making of the first progeny or the first offspring, right? Progeny means offspring. So from the viral entry till the first offspring is formed, this phase is called as, or this period is called as the eclipse phase. So you have gotten a question on this. What is an eclipse phase? So that is from the entry of the virus till the first offspring or the first progeny has been formed. Now, different viruses have different shapes, and you can get any one of these pictures or even others that you have to identify what is the shape and which virus is it. So let's see with the first one. The first one is shaped like this, right? It is shaped like this, and this is called as bullet shape. Remember, see, you remember how a bullet looks like? It looks something like, sorry, it looks something like this. So this is called as bullet shaped. And which virus is showing you this? It is going to be your rabies virus, right? So rabies virus is bullet shaped. Coming to the second one on the right. So what is this virus? This is going to be your pox virus, right? It looks like what? Can you see what this image looks like? It is called as the brick shaped. So have you seen a brick? This is what it is shaped like. So it is brick shaped, right? So brick shaped. Coming to the third virus here, if you see, it is looking like it has really long filaments, right? So it is filament in shape. It is filamentous. And what virus is this? This is going to be your Marburg, right? Marburg virus. Coming to the fourth one, the fourth one here shows the fourth one here shows you a round structure with four, projections coming out from it. So what is this? This looks like a space vehicle. So this looks like a space vehicle, like a spaceship, right? So this looks like a space vehicle or a spaceship, and it is seen in the adenovirus. Space vehicle shaped. Coming to the last one. So what does this look like? This looks like a wheel, right? So this looks like a wheel. So this is your wheel shaped or cartwheel shaped, whatever you want to call it. And this virus is going to be your rotavirus. So these are all the different shapes that you can get, and you can get, a picture of this, and you have to identify what virus is this. Now, coming to the laboratory diagnosis, we can't see the virus under the light microscope except your pox, but we can see other things that are called as inclusion bodies. So inclusion bodies are nothing, but they are the aggregation of the viral proteins or the virions. So when they come together, they form some kind of a structure which is called as inclusion bodies. Now, all the RNA viruses are going to have an intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies because they are being made and they are being replicated. Most of them are being replicated and assembled in the cytoplasm. And most of your DNA viruses are going to be intranuclear inclusion bodies because they are multiplying in the nucleus. Some of them can have both intranuclear and intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies. Now, first thing is the Negri bodies, which is by rabies. Then we have the Paskin bodies, which is by variola. Then we have the Guaneri bodies, which is for vaccinia. Bollinger bodies for fowlpox. Molluscum bodies or Henderson-Peterson bodies. I'm just going to write this. Henderson Peterson bodies. That is going to be, or we call it as the HP bodies for the molluscum contagiosum. And then we have the perinuclear bodies, which is for your reovirus. Coming to your intranuclear has been divided into two types, Cowdry type A and B. In A, we have the Taurus bodies, which is for yellow fever. We have the Lipschitz bodies, which is there for herpes, right? And then in B, we have the polio virus and then we have the adenovirus. Now, coming to both, so we have CMV virus, which shows you the owl's eye appearance, a very famous big eyes of the owls, and it looks like the eyes of the owl. So it's like an owl's eye appearance. And then we have measles, which shows us the Warthin-Finkeldy cells, intranuclear and intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies, right? Another way of diagnosing is by your egg inoculation. So we use an egg that is embryonated hen's egg, where the embryo is around 7 to 12 days old. So we have different layers of the eggs. If you see right here, we have different layers of the eggs. Right, so starting from the outermost layer, so this is the outermost layer, and this is going to be your chorioallantoic membrane. So in the chorioallantoic membrane, we have the pox and we have the herpes simplex virus that we can put here. Because pox and herpes simplex virus, they end up producing something called as pox. Pox are like these huge aggregations of, cells that if we see this egg in like in light, you will be able to see the pox. That is why they need to be on the superficial surface. So we have pox and then we have herpes. So coming to the next one, which is going to be your amniotic cavity. So amniotic cavity is something that kind of covers your chick, right? So like just like a baby, like just like a human baby that is covered in amniotic fluid, here the chick is also covered with the amniotic fluid. And what you can grow here is the influenza virus, right? You can grow the influenza virus here. Then we have something which is called as the yolk sac. So we have the yolk sac here, and in the yolk sac, we can grow the arboviruses and three bacteria also, because there are some bacteria that we cannot grow in the culture media. And what are they? So we have the rickettsia, we have the chlamydia, and then we have the Haemophilus ducreyi. So these three are the ones that we cannot, I mean, we can grow few of them, but for rickettsia and chlamydia, we can't, we don't have a culture media. So for them, we can do egg inoculation. Finally, coming to the last one, that is the allantoic cavity, that is also very big. This is the one which we can use for the vaccine production. So we can isolate viruses here for viral vaccines like influenza, yellow fever, and rabies. So please remember this egg because I've written everything here only. So please remember in which part or which cavity is the organism growing. Now we have something called as cell line. So usually before we were doing the egg inoculation, but then we don't have, it's only done for research purposes now. So now we have shifted to cell lines. So there's something called as a primary cell line, secondary cell line, and then continuous cell lines. In primary cell lines, they are normal cells from the organs that have a limited growth. So just like all the cells, every cell has to die at some point because they have limited growth, they have limited number of divisions. So because they are normal cells from the organs, they will also have limited growth. So they have around 5 to 10 divisions. That means they're going to divide 5 to 10 times and then the division is going to stop. They have a diploid karyosome, which is 2N, and it is used for the isolation of the viruses as well as vaccine production. So the examples are going to be MHC, that is your monkey kidney, human amnion, chick embryo. So these three are going to be your primary cell lines. Coming to the secondary or the diploid cell lines. So when we talk about the secondary and the diploid, they are also normal cells, but they have a higher number of division compared to the primary one. So they are going to be 10 to 15 divisions, and they also have a diploid karyosome, which is 2N. Now, the mnemonic is going to be MH. So firstly it was MHC, here it is only going to be MH, which contains MRC5, VI38, which is human embryonic lung cell strain. Then we have the human fibroblast cells, right, which are from the muscle cells. Then we have the continuous, so which is most commonly used now because we want the cells to continuously divide so that we can have more of the virus isolation. So they're derived from the cancerous cell because, as we know, cancerous cells have the ability to divide infinitely and they are immortal. So we have used those cells. They have a haploid chromosome and we do serial subculturing. That means in one pot, if we are trying to grow the continuous cell lines, we just take the cells from there, put it into another pot, and that starts becoming infinite. So leading to the infinite divisions of the continuous cell line. So we have cell lines like these, which are called as HeLa. Just mind you that all of these cell lines or most of these cell lines will be derived from some kind of a cancerous cell, like your human carcinoma of cervix, human epithelioma of larynx, human cancer of the nasopharynx, human synovial carcinoma, vervet monkey kidney, and baby hamster kidney. So these are all the HeLa, Hep2, KB, McCoy, Vero, BHK. These are all the different continuous cell lines derived from cancerous cells. Now we're going to be starting off with the DNA viruses, right? And the first group of viruses that we're going to be talking about is going to be your herpes virus. So herpes viruses are divided into different families. So first we are going to talk about the family which is alpha, and we have the first three human herpes virus 1, 2, and 3 in this family. So when we talk about the human herpes virus 1, it is also called as HSV1 or herpes simplex 1. Right, so herpes simplex 1 is your human herpes virus 1. Herpes simplex virus 2 is going to be your human herpes virus 2, and VZV is called as the varicella and zoster virus. So it is causing two disease, varicella as well as zoster. Starting, the important part about the herpes families are that they form latency in some kind of nerves. That means once you're infected, they might go inside your nerves and stay there for a very long time happily, and eventually, whenever your immune system goes down or something happens, they might come and erupt out. So, when we talk about the herpes simplex virus 1, so 1 and 2 are very similar. They will show a very similar clinical picture, just their areas are demarcated. So, anything that is above the waist, right? Any kind of herpes that is above the waist, that is going to be 1, and any kind of herpes that is below the waist is going to be 2. Right? So when we talk about above the waist, it is going to go into the latency in the trigeminal ganglia, which is the one that is supplying your facial area. And when we talk about below the waist, it is going to be in your sacral ganglia, right? So in the clinical pictures, what do you see? You see in herpes simplex virus 1, because everything is going to be above the waist, it is going to be a herpes labialis. That means herpes around your lips area. You can have temporal bone encephalitis, you can have Moilleritz meningitis, and even dendritic ulcers in your eyes, right? Or specifically your cornea. So these are the ones that are the clinical features for herpes simplex virus 1. Now, when we talk about HSV2, that means everything below the waist. So you are going to have genital vesicular ulcers that are painful with inguinal lymphadenopathy that is also painful, and you can also have certain congenital manifestations. So these are how you see these uh, ulcers. So they can be genital ulcers, they can be ulcers in different parts of the body that are fluid filled, and that is what you call as vesicular, right? That means fluid filled. So they are painful. One important thing is that they are multiple. So you will see multiple ulcers in the at the same time. So they are multiple, right? They are painful. They even have lymphadenopathy that is also painful, and they are fluid filled. So this is one of the causes of painful genital ulcers, right? That is going to be your HSV2. Now, when we talk about the varicella zoster virus, so it causes varicella, which is called as chicken pox, right? So we have had chicken pox in our lives. Remember, when we were young, we used to have maybe some of them were infected with chicken pox. So this is something which is called as varicella. and it is going into latency in the trigeminal ganglia. So these are vesicular rashes that are centripetal. So again, fluid-filled rashes that are centripetal means they start from the stomach and then they go around your body, and they have all stages of the ulcers at the same time. That means these rashes that you have, some of them can be fluid-filled, right? So there, some of them will be fluid filled, some of them may be crustating. So crusts are formed, some of them are just erupting. So they are just erupting. So these are different stages of the rash that can happen, and all of them can happen at the same time. Now, if a mother has, catches chickenpox during her first trimester of pregnancy, she can have congenital varicella. So, first trimester of pregnancy, if she catches chickenpox. So, what is going to happen to the baby? So, there is some, because organogenesis is going to take place during that time. So, baby can have limb hypoplasia. That means if you see the limbs, how they are very small and they are hypoplastic. So, these are limb hypoplasia. And you can have skin lesions, something like this. These are called as cicatricial lesions. So these are cicatricial lesions, and this is what a congenital varicella syndrome would look like. Then we have another disease called as zoster. It is also called as shingles or zona. So this is when the latency was there in the trigeminal nerves, and now after some kind of an immunocompromised state, this has erupted out. So usually you end up getting similar rashes, but only in one quadrant or dermatome. So dermatomes are made, that means whatever area that nerve is going to supply. So it's usually unilateral. So there's going to be one level of face being involved. So it is a unilateral or a dermatomal involvement. And you're going to have these rashes and rashes, and now they are called as the zoster, right? When we come to the staining, all of these 1, 2, and 3, all of them, we can do a Zang smear where we have taken the sample and we will see multinucleated giant cells. Also, I talked about the inclusion bodies because this is herpes, it is DNA virus, so it is going to be intranuclear, and we are going to see the Cowdry type A, which was the Lipschitz bodies, right? Egg inoculation is in your chorioallantoic membrane. Remember, I told you the outermost layer because herpes produces multinucleated giant cells, which I want to see, and they also produce big pox, and I want to see them in the light. So they are in the outermost membrane, which is your chorioallantoic membrane, and they are there along with the pox virus. In the cell lines, they show the ballooning of the cell. So because giant cells, they are multinucleated giant cells, big cells, that is also leading to ballooning of the cell lines. So that was your alpha family, which contained 1, 2, and 3 herpes, human herpes virus 1, 2, and 3. Moving on to the beta family now. So when we talk about the beta family, we have 5, 6, and 7. 5 is called as the cytomegalo virus, right? And 6 and 7 are just called as human herpes virus 6 and 7. So CMV is called as cytomegalovirus. So 1, 2, 3 are together, 5, 6, and 7 are together, and 4 and 8 are together. So when we talk about 5, again, because I said herpes families goes into some form of a latency. So here the CMV goes into a latency in the glands, which could be your salivary glands and even your kidneys. So, because it is there in your salivary glands, it does end up causing something which is called as a Kissing's disease. So, it causes your Kissing's disease also. Now, coming to the clinical manifestations, the most important manifestations is going to be your torch infection, right? So, torch is the group of congenital infections in which your C is for your CMV. And it is one of the most common cause to be associated with congenital infections. One of the most common cause to be associated with congenital infections, causing chorioretinitis, microcephaly, and hepatosplenomegaly. Now, another thing that I want you to remember is that this also causes calcifications, and they are ventricular calcifications, right? So CMV causes ventricular calcifications in the brain, right? Coming to the staining, if we take up the sample and we do an H&E staining, we are going to see the inclusion bodies and we are going to see both intranuclear and intracytoplasmic, and they are called as the owl's eye appearance. Just see how this is looking. It looks like these two big cells with nuclei looking like owl's eye. When we talk about serology, we are going to do the CMV specific antigen, which is called as PP65 antigen, and IgM antibody detection can be done. Finally, talking about the human fibroblast cell lines, these are the cell lines that can be used for the isolation of CMV. Now, coming to the HHV 6 and 7, they are going into latency in the T cells. In the T cells, it is called as, it's also known as the HSV6 is called as the human, it is also called as the sixth disease. And it causes roseola infanticum or exanthum subtuatum, where you're going to see these kind of a maculopapular rashes. Right, so maculopapular rashes are seen all over the child's body. It looks like roseola infanticum or exanthum subitum. Now coming to your gamma family, remember I told you 4 and 8 are together, so they are the gamma family. And in 4, it is the one which is called as the Epstein-Barr virus. So it is the Epstein-Barr virus, and HHV8 is called as the Kaposi sarcoma. So whenever we talk about the sarcoma, we're talking about some kind of a soft tissue tumor. They go into the latency in B cells. So B cells are the one that if there is any issue there, if there is going to be any issue in the B cells, this is going to lead to a lot of carcinomas, right? So this is going to lead to a lot of cancers or carcinomas. Coming to Epstein-Barr virus, so in clinical manifestations, it causes infectious mononucleosis. It causes the Kissing's disease or the glandular disease. Then it causes a lot of malignancies like your Burkitt lymphoma, nasopharyngeal carcinoma, Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. So these are all the different kind of malignancies it can cause, which is your Epstein-Barr virus. It also shows us the heterophile agglutination test, which is called as the Paul Bunel test. So Paul Bunel test is done for which virus? It is going to be done for your Epstein-Barr virus, where antibodies against the sheep RBCs are seen in the patient's serum. So we take the sheep RBCs and we make it react with the patient's serum because there are some antigens that are present on the sheep RBCs that are very similar to the antigens that are present on the Epstein-Barr virus. So they are called as heterophile antigens, right? They share similar structures. So if I want to check antibodies against Epstein-Barr virus in a patient's serum, I can just take the sheep RBCs, make them react, and because these antigens are similar, the antibodies against Epstein-Barr virus will also attach to these sheep RBCs, leading to their lysis, leading to their breakdown. That is something that we can see, and it is called as the Paul Bunel test. Now, coming to human herpes virus 8, which is called as Kaposi sarcoma. So, I told you it is going to be a soft tissue sarcoma of the vascular region. We're going to see purple to reddish purple growth. So, this is what it looks like. It is going to be a reddish to purple growth. Other than that, it can also cause your primary effusion lymphoma, and it can also cause your Castleman's disease, right? That completes our herpes, and now we're going to be moving to the next DNA virus, which is going to be your parvovirus. So parvovirus is also a DNA virus, but the only thing here is that it is a single-stranded DNA virus. So it is going to be a single-stranded DNA virus. So parvo says that I am the smallest because I have a single-stranded structure, and that is why I also have the smallest genome, right? Though I am a DNA virus, but I am extremely small. Transmission of parvoviruses is by the respiratory or the blood transfusion or even transplacental. Now, parvo comes under erythrovirus. Erythro means blood, right? Erythro means blood. That is why it loves the blood. So I remember it as parvovirus. parvo is love. And whom does it love? It loves the blood. So it is going to cause a lot of blood problems, blood related problems. So in the humans, where are the RBCs being made? So in the humans, in adults, it's made in the bone marrow. Right, in the adults, the RBCs are made in the bone marrow, and in the child, it is made in the fetal liver. So, in the child, it's made in the fetal liver, in the adults, it's made in the bone marrows. That is why, in adults, it affects the bone marrow, causing decrease in a lot of things, and in the child, it affects the liver. Now, when we talk about when we talk about the parvovirus, one very important thing, clinical feature that it causes is this appearance, which is called as a slap cheek, slapped cheek, slapped cheek appearance. That means it looks like this person has been slapped, but this is mainly because of the maculopapular rashes that this baby has. So this baby has rashes all over the body and all around the face and more around the cheeks. And that is why it looks like, although this is like a chilling, cool baby, but it looks like he's been slapped, right? So that's called as a slab cheek appearance that is going to be seen in your parvovirus. If it affects the fetal liver, if it affects the fetal liver, what is going to happen? It is going to lead to a fluid-filled stomach, and the baby is going to look a lot bloated and fluid-filled, and that is going to be called as your hydrops fetalis. So it is called as hydrops fetalis, and this is also something that is caused by your parvovirus B19. Other than that, in adults, it can also cause what? In the adults, because it affects the bone marrow, it can also cause aplastic crisis, right? That means different cell lines like your WBCs, RBCs, platelets, all will be decreased, leading to aplastic crisis. Moving on to the next DNA virus group, it's going to be the Papova, and it contains two of the things. One is your papilloma, which contains your human papilloma virus, HPV, and your polyoma virus. So when we talk about the papilloma or the HPV, human papilloma virus, it's divided into two types by the clinical forms. One is the benign, and then another one is going to be the malignant. So in the benign state, it leads to a lot of wart formation. So they can be common warts called as verruca vulgaris. There are flat warts called as verruca plana. There is plantar warts that is called as verruca plantaris. There's going to be anogenital warts called as condyloma acuminatum, which is also a sexually transmitted infection. So you can see these warts being produced on the penis or around the labia. So these are called as condyloma acuminata. So these are all the different kind of warts. One more thing, it can also cause your pharyngeal, can also cause pharyngeal warts, right? Also cause pharyngeal warts, but these are all benign. These things can also be causing malignant disease. So we can have the cervical lesions causing cervical intraepithelial neoplasia, which is mainly by your HPV 6 and 11, and your carcinoma cervix, which is by HPV 16 and 18. This laryngeal or pharyngeal warts can also get converted into cancers, and hence it can cause your laryngeal and esophageal cancers by HPV 16 and 18. So HPV 16 and 18 type are the ones that are very cancerous, right? Moving on to now molluscum contagiosum. So molluscum contagiosum is something where the transmission is taking place by the direct contact. That means from a case or from an indirect contact, which is by barbers using the same scissors or you're using towels or swimming pools, and rarely it's going to be sexual. Now, I have moved on to the RNA viruses, by the way, and molluscum comes under your pox viruses, right? So this comes under your pox viruses. Okay. So, what are the lesions going to be like? So, lesions here are going to be pink, pearly, and wart-like. They are umbilicated. That means it's going to be a rounded structure with a dent in the center, like a dent in the center or a dimple in the center called as the umbilication. They are present singly or in clusters, and they are present in all body except your palms and your soles. So, molluscum contagiosum is actually a clinical diagnosis more than it is a microbiological diagnosis, because these lesions are very, very specific, right? So, they are very, very specific, and you can just see them clinically and diagnose a person with molluscum contagiosum. Now, they also produce intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies called as molluscum bodies, right? They are called as molluscum bodies, or they are called as Henderson-Peterson bodies, right? So they are the intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies, because now we have moved to the RNA viruses, and we know that RNA viruses, most of them have intracytoplasmic inclusion bodies. Moving on to the myxoviruses. So now when we talk about the myxoviruses as a whole, myxoviruses have something in common. That means they bind to the mucin receptors on the RBCs, right? So they bind to the mucin receptors, causing clumping or something called as the hemagglutination. So whenever on the RBCs, so on the RBCs, there are these mucin receptors to which this virus is going to come and bind to this mucin receptors. Right? Now, there are two types of myxoviruses. We have divided them into orthomyxo and paramyxo. In orthomyxo, we only have one virus, which is going to be your influenza virus. But in paramyxo, we have a lot of them, like the parainfluenza virus, your measles, mumps, respiratory syncytial virus, metapneumovirus, Hendra, as well as Nipah. So they are all paramyxo and orthomyxo. But the first thing that we're going to be starting off is with the orthomyxo. So influenza belongs to the orthomyxovirus. Right? It belongs to the orthomyxovirus. And as I said, they attach to the mucin receptors on the RBCs and lead to the clumping or the heme agglutination. That is why it contains something called as heme agglutinin, which is denoted by an H and an A. And it has something called as neuraminidase, which is denoted by an N and an A. Now let's see the structure here. If we see the structure here, we are seeing these, uh, mushroom-shaped things, I would call them. So these are these mushroom-shaped things which are called as, which are Na, which are the neuraminidase. And then we have these pointy triangle-looking structures which are called as Ha, which is your heme agglutinin. Right? So they're called as hemagglutinin. Another thing that you're seeing here is, remember the Bora Bora Islands? Remember I told you that in that O is for the orthomyxo, that means influenza. So they are going to have a segmented structure. So they are going to have different strands that are segmented, and they contain up to 8 segments of single-stranded RNA. So they have up to 8 segments of single-stranded RNA. So hemagglutinin is actually triangular. It attaches to the mucin receptors, leading to clumping or agglutination, and it helps in the entry of the virus. Now, after the virus has entered, the other structure has to be removed, and for that we have the neuraminidase. Neuraminidase does everything opposite to the hemagglutinin, so it is mushroom shaped. It degrades the sialic acid receptors which are present on the RBCs. So it reverses the hemagglutination. This is called as elution. So it's reversing that. The virus is able to detach itself, right? So this is called as elution. Now, what are the types? So, there are two types of things that are seen in your influenza. One is called as the antigenic drift, and one is called as the antigenic shift. Drift is something that happens over a span of time, right? So, drift is something that is happening slowly, and you're slowly drifting away. So there is going to be a point mutation that has happened somewhere in your either HA or the NA gene, and this leads to the change in the amino acid sequence. Now, if the amino acid sequence has changed, eventually the genome is going to be changed, so some new strain is being created. And this leads to a lot of outbreaks and minor epidemics, occurs every 2 to 3 years, and this is seen specifically in influenza A and B, right? So, point mutation in the HA and NA, it is a drift, it is not that severe, it is a new strain is created, but small epidemics and outbreaks occur every 2 to 3 years, and it is by influenza A and B. Shift is when the whole is going to be like abrupt, and it's going to be drastic change in the HA and NA gene, and it is going to be due to the genetic reassortment. Genetic reassortment is something that happens. Let me give you an example. Suppose we have a pig, right? So we have a pig in which contains receptors, right? So we have one strain that is of the bird strain, and then we have another strain that is a human strain. Now, pigs are also called as the amplifier host, right? So they are also called as the amplifier host. And one important thing is that pigs contain receptors for both human virus and the bird virus. So now this bird virus is going to come inside the pig, right? And this human virus is also going to come inside the pig. Now, because because the pig has receptors for both human and bird, there is going to be some level of rearrangement or genetic assortment that is going to take place, because of which what is going to happen? A new strain will be formed, which will be completely different from the parent strain. It will be completely different from this human strain or this bird strain, right? So completely different new strain, and this is particularly causing a lot of pandemics. So this will lead to a lot of pandemics, right? Pandemics and epidemics. And this is something that occurs every 10 years, thankfully, right? It occurs less, it occurs every 10 years, and it is mainly seen in influenza A virus, right? So, this is what genetic reassortment means. Now, I'm going to move on to mumps. Mumps is a disease which is caused by the mumps virus, and it causes bilateral parotid swelling, which is going to be the most common clinical manifestation. So, any patient who's coming with bilateral parotid swelling, always and always first think about mumps. It also causes orchitis in males and aseptic meningitis. We do have a live attenuated vaccine for it, which is called as the Gerald Lynn strain. So we have the Gerald Lynn strain, which is the live attenuated vaccine for mumps. Talking about measles now. So when we talk about measles, measles is also called as rubeola. So usually person is going to have fever on the 10th day from the, getting the infection. There's going to be a week, there's going to be a time for incubation period. Then first symptom is going to be fever. That is going to be on the 10th day. Then 2 days later, the person is going to have Koplik spots. So Koplik spots are nothing, but they are bluish, whitish spots that are present on your, like, near to your second molar tooth. So they're going to be present adjacent to your second molar tooth, and these are called as Koplik spots, but these are something that can be very easily missed. So we have fever, then we have the Koplik spots. Then on the 14th day, we're going to have a rash. And the rash is going to start from where? It's going to start from behind the ears, right? Behind the ears, then going to the face, then going to the trunks, and then going to the legs. This is called as a centrifugal arrangement. So this is called as centrifugal. It is called as centrifugal rash, where it's behind the ears, then face, trunks, and legs. In cell lines, it shows the Wharton-Finkledy cell lines, and the vaccine strain is called as the Edmonston strain. So this is the vaccine strain that we use when we have to vaccinate for measles. Moving on to now Nipah and Hendra. There's only two, three things that I want you to know about this is that it is a zoonotic infection. That means it is transmitted by animals. The reservoir is usually fruit bats or called as flying foxes. For Hendra, the disease is transmitted by horses, and for Nipah, it is going to be by the pigs. So what you need to remember is the fruit bat because you get a lot of questions on this. Coming to your RSV, which is the respiratory syncytial virus, and this usually affects the children. So, whenever somebody asks you what is the most common cause for lower respiratory tract infections in infants causing bronchiolitis or pneumonia, it is going to be your respiratory syncytial virus, which has an incubation period of 3 to 5 days. That means after getting the virus, it will take 3 to 5 days for the symptoms to start appearing. So this is called as the respiratory syncytial virus, which is affecting children. And most common cause of lower respiratory tract infections in infants, it's going to be causing bronchiolitis or pneumonia. It is the respiratory syncytial virus. Now, when we want to talk about rubella, rubella does not belong to the paramyxoviridae, but I am discussing it here because, the vaccine of measles, mumps, and rubella is given together. It belongs to the family of Togaviridae and the genus Rubivirus. Now, one important thing is that rubella is also called as German measles, right? It's also called as German measles, and measles is called as rubeola. So that can be a little bit confusing. Rubella, the important thing is that you need to diagnose the infection with rubella uh, because early in the pregnancy because it causes congenital rubella syndrome. It can be teratogenic, and as I said, there's the torch group of infections in which the R is for the rubella. So rubella can cause congenital rubella syndrome. That is maximum risk of infection is in the first trimester. And clinically, what do you see? So I have always tried to make, a triad. So I have an eye. I'm going to make a triad. So I have an eye, then I have a ear, and then I have a heart, right? So I have a eye, a ear, and a heart, and this is the triad that we have. So this you can make a triangle joining these three things, an eye, ear, and heart. You can make a triangle like this. So what does it cause? So in the ear defects, it causes sensory neural hearing defects. In your ocular defects, it's going to cause salt and pepper retinopathy. And another thing that it causes is the cataract. Just going to add it here. So it can also cause cataract, right? And in your cardiac defects, it can cause patent ductus arteriosus, PDA, which is called as patent ductus arteriosus, right? Patent ductus arteriosus. Then we have the pulmonary stenosis and even ventricular defects. So this is the triad that we have. So we have the ear, we have the eyes, and then we have the heart, right? So that is the triad for rubella. Moving on to the Coxsackie virus, which is also part of your para-influenza virus, which is also part of your paramyxoviruses. So Coxsackie virus, it's divided into A and B type based upon the pathogenicity in the suckling mice. Now, A is the one in which the paralysis is flaccid type and the clinical features usually generalized myositis. And in B, the paralysis is usually spastic and it shows as your localized myositis. Now, what you get a question on is the hand, foot, and mouth disease. Most common cause of hand, foot, and mouth disease or vesicular rashes, it's going to be your Coxsackie virus. Other than that, it does cause your aseptic meningitis, which is A7 and A9 in your A type. That means Coxsackie A, and in B from B1 to B6. It causes herpangina, which is also vesicular pharyngitis, where you're having vesicular lesions in your pharynx. So this is your Coxsackie virus. Now, there is a group of arboviruses, and this group of viruses are the ones that are from AR, we have the arthropod, And from BO, we have bone. That means they are transmitted by the help of an arthropod or an insect, right? So they're arthropod borne or insect borne viruses. So the first family that we are going to talk about is the Togaviridae. In Togaviridae, it can be divided clinically with the ones that are causing you arthralgia or if they are causing encephalitis. So in arthralgia, we have the chikungunya, which is by your Aedes virus, which is by your Aedes mosquito. And then in the encephalitis, we have the Eastern, Western, and the Venezuelan, which is also by the Aedes or the Culex. So what you need to remember is the different vectors. In your flaviviridae is also again divided into arthralgia and encephalitis, and it also causes hemorrhage. So in your arthralgia ones, it is by the Zika, which is by Aedes mosquito. In hemorrhage, we have the dengue hemorrhage, yellow fever, and the KFD, which is called as the Kyasanur forest disease, right? So Kyasanur forest disease. So the dengue and the yellow fever is by Aedes, but KFD is by the tick. Then we have encephalitis, in which we have the JE, which is your Japanese encephalitis, right? So we have the Japanese encephalitis and West Nile, which is by your Culex mosquito. Now, moving on to Zika. Zika is something that I want to talk about is because you've been getting a lot of questions on Zika virus. So the vector I told you is your Aedes aegypti. It can also be your Aedes albopictus. Reservoir is going to be the monkey. So monkeys are the ones that are carrying this virus. How does the transmission happen? Transmission happens from mother to child during placenta or delivery or even sexual. The thing is that in adults, it usually doesn't lead to any kind of a clinical manifestation. It's mostly asymptomatic, but it can also lead to Zika fever, which is causing rash and conjunctivitis. But in the fetus, it causes a lot of congenital manifestations. And what does it cause most commonly? It causes microcephaly. And this is something that you have gotten a question on that microcephaly is caused by which virus? It's going to be the Zika virus. Now coming to the rhabdoviruses. So rhabdoviruses are the ones that are divided into two types. We can have the Lassa virus, which contains the rabies, and then we can have the vesiculovirus, which contains the vesiculostomatitis virus. In rabies, I have already talked about the shape, which it is going to be the brick shaped, right? It's going to be the brick shaped. But I want to talk about this picture right here, which is, showing me these roundish structures with the arrows. What are these? These are your inclusion, inclusion bodies. So because rabies is an RNA virus, so these are going to be intracytoplasmic, right? So as you can see, this one is the nucleus. So it is beyond that, it is in the cytoplasm. So it is going to be intracytoplasmic. And what is the name of this? It is called as the Negri bodies. So it is going to be called as the Negri bodies, and this has come as an MCQ previously. Now we're going to talk about the retroviruses. So retroviruses are the ones, remember, that have the biggest genome. So they are the ones that have the biggest genome, and they are also the one that, although are RNA viruses, but they multiply in nucleus. Right? So they multiply in the nucleus because retroviruses want to get integrated into our host DNA. Now, if we see the structure of the retrovirus, it is a single-stranded virus, but it contains two strands, right? It contains two strands, and then we have a knob-like structure on it, and this is called as the reverse transcriptase. Because it is an RNA virus, it cannot get integrated into the human DNA. So, with the help of this reverse transcriptase, it first reverses itself and becomes a DNA virus, and then it integrates into our host DNA. Now, on the surface of it, it contains an envelope. And in the envelope, it contains mainly two types of proteins. So one is your GP or glycoprotein 120 or 41, right? Then it has a matrix, it has a core. This core is going to contain the RNA, and this RNA contains two copies of single-stranded uh, virus. Now, when we talk about the envelope, the GP 120 is a knob-like structure. Okay, let's see here. So GP 120 is like a knob-like structure, and GP 41 is the anchor. So these are the anchor pedicels. They are the one that is anchoring it to the cell. So GP 41 is the anchor. In the nucleocapsid, it is an icosahedral symmetry where there are single-stranded RNA, but as I said, it contains two copies. Enzymes are there that are the reverse transcriptase, integrase, proteases, all of these are the enzymes. Now, when we talk about the structural genes, so structural genes are the ones that make up the structure of the virus, and we have the mnemonic PEG. So in PEG, the G stands for the GAG, and GAG are the one that makes the core and the shell. So let's go back. So this is GAG is the one that is going to make up the core. So this is the core. So GAG is making the core and it is making the shell. So this is also made by GAG. So let's see which are the proteins involved. So we have the P55, which is further divided into P18, which is making the matrix and the shell. And we have P24 and P15, which is making the core. That is why it is very important to detect this P24 antigen because it is part of the core of the virus. Right, so if you want to detect the virus early, we can test for this antigen, which is the P24 antigen. Moving on to in PEG, we had P. P is for Paul. Pol is the short form for polymerase. So it is the enzymes that are being produced. So we have 31, 51, and 66. 31 is called as an integrase because it is going to integrate itself into the DNA. And 51 is called as a reverse transcriptase because it first has to convert itself to a DNA from an RNA virus to finally get integrated into the DNA. Now, in PEG, we had E. E is for the envelope. That means it's going to make up the envelope glycoproteins, and we had two of them. We had the P120 and 41. 120 is for the attachment to the CD4 cells, which are the T cells, and P41 is for the fusion protein, right? It is for the fusion proteins. Then it has certain non-structural genes as well, which are not making up the structures. One important thing is that when the GP 120 of the virus, so if this is your HIV virus, right, it contains this GP 120 on its surface. This GP 120 has to go and attach to the T cells, right? So this is going to attach to the T cells, where I'm going to make it a little different. So I'll say here is the GP 120 which has to attach to the T cells. But just the basic attachment doesn't lead to anything. It requires something else, which is like a co-receptor that also should attach. And this co-receptor is called as CXCR4 if it has to attach to the T lymphocytes, and it is CCR5 it is if it needs to attach to the macrophages. So co-receptor binding also has to occur for the final activation of the T cells, right? Then we have the clinical features of the retroviruses, and one important thing is that this graph that I am showing you, so this graph tells us the CD4 count and what disease that can happen at which CD4 count. So when the CD4 count reaches 500, right? So CD4 count is based upon the number of CD4 cells that are there. So the lower the CD4 cells or the T cells, the more the infections can happen, right? So CD4 cells or the T cells are the one that fight against different kinds of infections. But here, as the CD4 counts keep decreasing, infections keep increasing. So at 500, we have the bacterial skin infections, herpes simplex virus, and fungal infections. So in fungal infections, particularly, we are talking about the candidiasis, right? Okay, at 400, what do we have? We have the Kaposi sarcoma. At 300 CD4, we have the hairy leukoplakia or tuberculosis, right? At 200, we have the pneumocystis pneumonia, cryptococcosis, and toxoplasmosis. At 50, we have MAC, CMV, and lymphoma. What is MAC? MAC is your Mycobacterium tuberculosis avium complex. So this is something that is there that causes pneumonias and infections in patients whose CD4 has reached under 50. So this you need to remember because they ask you at what CD4 which infection starts happening. Now, there are certain screening tests that we can do for HIV, and then there are certain confirmatory tests. So, when we talk about the screening tests, in screening tests, mainly we are doing the immunochromatographic test, and once they come positive, if we need, then we have to confirm it by either Western blot. So, in Western blot, what happens? Detection is there against the P24 core antigen after 112 to 26 days. So here what happens, so we have antigens coated on a strip, right? So actually it's not coated on a strip. We are doing some kind of a blotting. But just to make it simpler, so we have blotted the antigens on the strip, right? So we have separated and blotted the antigens on the strip. And then in the patient sample, we try to find the antibodies against the antigen. So here we have the P18, 24, 31, 40, 41, different antigens that I told you. Some are going to be the structural, some are going to be the non-structural. So they detect the antibodies against the P24 core antigen. Then we have others like viral RNA detection, which can happen around 10 to 14 days. You can just directly check the RNA, and then we can also do the DNA PCR, which will tell us when the RNA has been incorporated into our DNA. That is, will be the DNA PCR. Now, there is something called as a window period in which the exposure has happened, right? So, exposure has happened, but the antibodies become detectable at what level? So, that period when the exposure to the detectable levels of antibody in the serum, that point is called as the window period. So, during this time, we can't be using the antibodies because they've not been made. So we have to detect the antigen. So here either we can do the RNA testing, we can directly test the amount of HIV RNA. This is going to be the best because it comes as early as 10 to 14 days because RNA is the one that is entering. So in the window period, best is to do the RNA detection, right? Because that is going to be there. And the second one is going to be the antigen detection. You can't do the antibody because in the window period, the whole point is exposure to the detectable levels of antibodies in the serum. So next we can do the antigen testing, which is going to be the P24 antigen, because I told you it is the core antigen. This takes from 12 to 16 days. After this, the antibodies will be made and you can do the antibody testing at 3 to 12 weeks. When we talk about the pediatric HIV infection, if we want to diagnose a patient who is a child and if we want to diagnose HIV, we have to do the HIV DNA PCR at 6 weeks by dried blood spot. Because initially, so we are doing HIV DNA PCR because we want to see how much of the DNA has been incorporated into our DNA. So we do the DNA PCR at 6 weeks by dried blood spot. So that completes our retroviruses, and now we're going to be moving on to the hepatitis viruses. So when we talk about the hepatitis viruses, we have different types. We have A, B, C, D, and E, right? And one G is also added, but it's not so important to us. When we talk about the hepatitis A virus, we call it as the infectious hepatitis because it is infectious and it is transmitted by your fecal-oral route. Hepatitis B virus is the only virus that is the DNA virus in this hepatitis group. Rest all are going to be your RNA virus, right? So rest all are RNA viruses. This is the only one which is the DNA virus in this group. So hepatitis B is called as serum hepatitis. HCV or hepatitis C is called as non-A, non-B virus or post-transfusion hepatitis because it is transmitted by transfusion reactions also. Hepatitis D is called as the delta agent and E is called as non-A, non-B enteric transmitted hepatitis. So E is for the enteric transmitted hepatitis. Now, what families are they belonging to? So, hepatitis A belongs to the enterovirus 72, which is your Picorna viridae, right? Then we have your hepatitis B, which is for your Hepedna. C is for Flavi. D is unclassified, and even E is unclassified. Now, what is important to you is the genome, right? In the genome, what is important is that it is a single-stranded RNA. All of them are single-stranded RNA, except, as I said, Hepedna, because it is a double-stranded DNA, right? Now, coming to the age. So, at what age? So, most common cause of hepatitis in children. Most common cause of hepatitis in children and young adults is going to be hepatitis A virus, right? Other than that, this is what is important in age. What is going to be the route? For hepatitis A viruses, it is going to be the feco-oral route, and even for your hepatitis E, it is going to be the feco-oral route. Other than that, for the rest three, they are the same. It can be percutaneous, sexual, or vertical. So percutaneous, sexual, or vertical for both B, for all B, C, and D. Now coming to the incubation period. For incubation period, we have for hepatitis A 30, then double it, we have 60 to 90 for B. Then the average, it's going to be 50 for hepatitis C. Then for D also, D is going to mimic everything that B is doing, so that is going to be 60 to 90. And then we have hepatitis E, which is going to be average 40. Coming to the chronicity and the carrier state. So when we talk about the carriers, you just need to know that hepatitis A, sorry, hepatitis B and C will be showing a carrier, right? And these are also the ones that are going to be showing you the chronicity stage, right? So they can also become chronic. Now, moving on to the hepatitis B virus. So when we talk about the hepatitis B genome, remember I told you this is also the one that contains a partial double-stranded DNA, and that is why this, along with the parvovirus, also has the smallest genome because it is partial and double-stranded. Now, what are the different kinds of genes that are involved here? So we have the S ones that are the S, pre-S1 and pre-S2. So S, pre-S1, pre-S2, this gene ends up making your hepatitis B surface antigen. So HBsAg, right? Coming to the C one, we have a C gene and we have a pre-C gene. So C is going to end up making the core and pre-C is going to make up the E. So hepatitis E antigen. So pre is going to make up the E, core C is going to make up the core. Now we have something which is called as the X gene, which is here. So this X gene, so whenever we want to talk about danger, we make the X. So this is HBxAg. This is danger. So this increases the cancer by binding to the P53. So a lot of times hepatitis B ends up leading to hepatocellular carcinoma, right? And that is something that can be seen by your hepatitis X antigen, right? Because of the hepatitis X antigen. Now coming to the P gene. P gene is present here. Can you see? P gene is the one that is the largest, and this ends up making the polymerase. So it's going to make the DNA polymerase, reverse transcriptase, RNase H activity. So this is the P gene. Now we are going to talk about the carriers. I told you hepatitis B can eventually form carriers. That means the person itself is not going to have any like any clinical symptoms, but that person can spread the infection. It can be a carrier. So just remember that whenever we talk about a hepatitis E antigen being positive, we are talking that it is actively replicating, right? And whenever we talk about HBS antigen or the surface antigen, we talk if there is presence of this, it will tell us the chronicity and the infectivity. Now, there are two types of carriers. We have the simple carriers and then we have the super carriers. Simple carriers are called as chronic. So whenever I said we will have chronic, we are going to have HBS antigen positive, and but it is inactive. That means it's not multiplying. It's not replicating. So if replication is not going to be there, HBE antigen is going to be negative. So it's going to have a low infectivity also, right? When we talk about super, super are the ones that are going to be like a Superman. So they are going to be immunotolerant to anything. So we will have HBS antigen positive because it is chronic. We will have, because it is immune tolerant, HBE antigen positive, and others also like DNA polymerase and hepatitis HBV DNA. That is called as super carriers. They're going to be like Superman. They'll carry everything with them. Coming to chronic hepatitis. So these are the ones that are the cases, right? So these are the ones that are the cases. So we can have the chronic active, chronic inactive. So everything is same here. Everything is going to be same here except one thing. And that is going to be what I've highlighted, the presence of HBe antigen or not, right? So HBe antigen or not is present. That is what is different. So, as I said, chronic is there, so hepatitis HBS antigen has to be there. So, IgG, HBC is going to be there. It is there here also. Right? Hepatitis HBV DNA is here also. HBV DNA is going to be here also. Signs and symptoms are there. Signs and symptoms are there. So everything is the same. The only difference is that because this is inactive, that means it is not replicating. Because there are antibodies against your HBE, which is the one that was replicating. And here, because it is active, so HBE has to be present. So it is HBE antigen positive. Moving on to this, which is what comes in your exams a lot of times. This is a graph that has been given, and here you have the incubation period, you have the disease, you have the early and the late convalescent period, you have the HBS antigen, HBS, anti-HBS, etc. So they are trying to show you here. Let's see what is the first antigen that is being raised. So the first antigen that is being raised here is your HBS antigen. So if anybody asks you first antigen to come positive, it's going to be what? It's going to be your HBS antigen, right? Then what is the next antigen that is going to come positive? So next to your HBS, we have the E antigen. So the second antigen to come positive, it is going to be your HBe antigen, right? So it's going to be your HBe antigen. What is the first antibody that comes positive? The first antibody that comes positive, it's going to be your anti-HBC. C is for the core. So this is the first antibody that comes positive, right? Now, where is HBC located? So if we talk about the core antigen, that is your HBC antigen, this is present in the core of the hepatocytes. So because this is present in the core of the hepatocytes, it doesn't come in the serum. Hence, we are not able to detect it or diagnose it. So if you want to ever look at the HBC antigen, the only thing you can do is immunohistochemistry, right? Or you can do immunofluorescence testing. That means you can take a tissue sample from the liver and then you can do the immunofluorescence testing on it, or you can do the immunohistochemistry testing there to find the core antigen. But you will never be able to find the core antigen in the serum because it doesn't come in the peripheral blood. Right? So you will only see what? You can only see the antibodies, but you will never see the antigen. Now, what happens after some time, at approximately 3 weeks, what is going to happen? Antibodies against the HBS antigen, is going to start getting made, it's going to start reducing, and now these antibodies have come up. Similarly, for your HBE also, it's finally going to go down and then the antibodies will start appearing. So we have the anti-HBE, anti-HBS, right? So this is all the different kinds of graphs that we have, all the different kinds of graphs that is showing you what is the first antigen to come positive, what is the first antibody to come positive, when will the antigen start decreasing and the antibody start increasing. So this graph kind of tells you everything. So also just remember any time when it is showing you that anything is IgM anti HBC, for example, positive, that means whenever there's going to be IgM antibodies, it's going to be an acute infection. And if the same thing changes into your IgG antibodies, it is going to be of the chronic infection.